The VIP lounge at Denver International Airport smelled like sandalwood and silence. Marcus Caldwell stood at the entrance, flannel shirt wrinkled, boots caked with Colorado mud, a battered backpack slung over one shoulder. Elena Navarro, the lounge manager, blocked his path. She looked him up and down, her eyes cataloging every scuff, every wrinkle, every reason he didn't belong. Then she spoke loud enough for every premium guest to hear. "Sir, this area is for premium passengers only. I need you to get the hell out." Marcus held her gaze for a long moment. He didn't argue. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Tyler. "Jet, touching down in 12 minutes, boss." 4 hours earlier, when the sky over Ridgeline, Colorado was still the color of wet slate, Marcus Caldwell backed his pickup truck out of a gravel driveway and pointed it east toward Denver. The heater rattled. The windshield wipers dragged across a thin layer of frost. On the passenger seat sat a battered canvas backpack, and inside it, folded with unusual care, was the only suit Marcus owned, a navy blue, two-button he had bought 6 years ago for his wife's funeral and hadn't worn since. Today, he would wear it again, this time on a stage in Washington, D.C., where the Department of Defense was awarding him the Thornton Prize for Innovation in Autonomous Systems. It was the highest civilian honor in the defense technology sector, given to the individual whose work had most significantly advanced the nation's strategic capabilities. Marcus Caldwell, the man driving a truck with a cracked taillight and a coffee stain on the dashboard, was that individual. He was 37 years old. He had the kind of face that aged not from vanity but from weather and worry, sun-browned skin from years of working outdoors, deep lines around his eyes that came from squinting at circuit boards in poorly lit workshops, and a jaw that always seemed slightly clenched, as though he were solving a problem no one else could see. His hands were calloused. His boots were the same pair he wore to job sites, to the grocery store, and apparently to airports. He looked like a rancher, or maybe a high school shop teacher. He did not look like the founder and sole owner of Caldwell Dynamics, a private aerospace and defense company whose drone guidance systems were currently deployed across 4 branches of the United States military. That was by design. Marcus had spent the last 3 years building his company from a workshop behind his house into a 200-person operation with government contracts worth more than he cared to count, and he had done it all without a single press interview, without a social media account, and without ever once appearing on a list of America's wealthiest entrepreneurs. The world of defense contracting didn't require fame, it required results. And Marcus delivered results the way he did everything else, quietly, precisely, and without asking for applause. He called Mrs. Dawson at 6:15. She was 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher who lived 3 houses down and had been watching Sophie since Rachel died. "I've got her lunch packed," Mrs. Dawson said. "Peanut butter and honey, no crust, just the way she likes it." Marcus smiled. "Bring her to the airport by 9. Terminal 2, the main check-in hall. I'll have everything ready by then." He paused. "Until her captain gets his own seat on the plane. She'll want to know that." Mrs. Dawson laughed. "That bear gets better treatment than most people I know." Marcus arrived at Denver International Airport just after 7. The terminal was already humming with the low-grade chaos of winter travel families, dragging oversized suitcases, business travelers hunched over laptops, the constant drone of departure announcements bouncing off the high glass ceiling. He walked to the check-in counter and found himself standing in front of a woman whose name tag read Grace Pemberton. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair pinned neatly behind her ears and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. She looked up at Marcus, and her hands went still on the keyboard. "Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly, her voice catching. "I remember you. Rachel used to talk about you so much when she was." She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. Her eyes glistened. Marcus looked at her with a gentle, tired recognition. "You were on the oncology floor," he said. "You volunteered on Tuesdays." Grace nodded. "She was the bravest woman I ever met. And she adored you. She said you were building something that would change the world, but that you'd never let anyone know it was you." Marcus glanced down at his boots. "She gave me too much credit." He looked back up. "Grace, I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention my name to anyone here. I'm just a dad taking his daughter on a trip." Grace nodded without hesitation and checked him in 2 seats. Economy class, Denver to Washington, D.C. Elena Navarro appeared behind the counter like a cold front moving in. She was 33, tall, with dark hair pulled tight and a pressed blazer that looked like it had been tailored that morning. She managed the VIP lounge operations for the airline's premium terminal, and she ran her section with surgical precision. Every detail mattered to Elena: the temperature of the champagne, the angle of the magazines, the caliber of the guests. She had clawed her way up from a part-time gate agent to this position in just 3 years, and she intended to keep climbing. She glanced at Grace, then at the man in the flannel shirt standing at the counter, then back at Grace with a look that could frost glass. "Pemberton, we have a line. Keep it moving." Grace flinched. Elena's eyes swept over Marcus' once boots, backpack, no designer luggage, and she walked away without a word. 20 minutes later, the overhead speakers crackled with the announcement Marcus had been dreading. His flight to Washington had been canceled. A winter storm system had stalled over the Great Plains, grounding all eastbound departures until further notice. The terminal erupted into low-grade panic-long lines at the rebooking counters, raised voices, the particular frustration of people whose plans had been shattered by something they couldn't argue with. Marcus stood still in the middle of it, not panicked but calculating. The award ceremony was tomorrow evening. There were no other commercial options that would get him there in time. He pulled out his phone and called Tyler Marsh. Tyler had been Marcus's pilot for 2 years, but they had known each other for much longer. They had served together, Marcus as a systems engineer, Tyler as a helicopter pilot in the same unit overseas. Tyler had left the military the same year Marcus did, and when Marcus told him he needed a pilot for his company's Gulfstream G700, Tyler didn't even ask about the salary. "Say less," he had said. "When do I start?" Now, Tyler answered on the second ring. "Let me guess," Tyler said. "Flight's canceled." Marcus almost smiled. "Can you get the Gulf up from the Springs?" Tyler was already moving. "Wheels up in 40 minutes. I'll be at Den in about 2 hours. "Sit tight, boss," Marcus called Mrs. Dawson and told her to bring Sophie on schedule. He would handle the rest. The problem was finding a place to wait. The main terminal had become a refugee camp of stranded travelers. Every seat taken, every outlet occupied, children crying, couples arguing, the air thick with collective frustration. Marcus looked across the hall toward the frosted glass doors of the VIP lounge. It was quiet in there. He could see leather chairs, soft lighting, space. He just needed a place to sit for 2 hours until Sophie arrived and the jet landed. He walked to the lounge entrance and asked if he could purchase a day pass. Elena Navarro was the one who met him at the door. She stood with her shoulders squared and her chin slightly elevated, the posture of someone accustomed to being the gatekeeper between the ordinary and the exclusive. She asked to see his boarding pass. Marcus showed her his economy ticket and explained that his flight had been canceled, that he was waiting for his daughter and an alternative arrangement, and that he simply needed a quiet place to sit. He offered to pay whatever the day rate was. Elena looked at the ticket, then looked at Marcus. Her eyes traveled from his mud-caked boots to his wrinkled flannel shirt to the frayed strap of his backpack. She took in every detail, the way a jeweler examines a stone not to find its value, but to confirm its worthlessness. "This lounge is by invitation or business class only," she said, her voice pleasant but final. "We don't sell day passes to everyone." The pause before the word everyone was surgical. It said everything her professional training wouldn't allow her to say directly. Marcus tried once more. He explained that his 6-year-old daughter was on her way and that he wanted a safe, comfortable place for her to wait. Elena's expression didn't change. "Sir, I understand, but our policy is clear. The public waiting area is down the hall to the left." As she spoke, a couple approached behind Marcus, the man in a cashmere overcoat, the woman carrying a handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Elena's face transformed instantly. The ice melted into warmth. The gatekeeper became a hostess. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, welcome back. Your usual seats are ready. Can I have sparkling water brought over?" She held the door open with a smile that Marcus understood was not meant for people like him. He turned and walked away. Elena added, just loudly enough to reach him, "Sir, the public area really is quite comfortable. I'm sure you'll find a seat eventually." Marcus stopped. He didn't turn around. He stood still for a moment, breathing slowly, and in the silence of that breath, he heard Rachel's voice. Not a memory, not an echo, but the warm, steady sound of the woman who had known him better than anyone. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small, Marcus. But also, don't waste your fire on people who aren't ready to feel the heat." He walked away. Inside the lounge, a man in his 50s sat in a leather armchair near the window, reading the Financial Times. He had watched the entire exchange through the glass. He smiled faintly, satisfied, and returned to his newspaper. Mrs. Dawson's old Buick pulled up to the terminal drop-off at exactly 9 o'clock. Sophie Caldwell tumbled out of the back seat like a small, joyful hurricane brown hare in two uneven pigtails that Mrs. Dawson had clearly done her best with, a pink backpack covered in star-shaped patches, and Captain, the stuffed bear, dangling from her right hand by one well-loved arm. She was 6 years old, and she had her mother's eyes wide, gray-green, and filled with a curiosity that never seemed to rest. She spotted Marcus through the glass doors and broke into a run. "Daddy." She launched herself at him with the full-body commitment that only small children possess, wrapping her arms around his neck and pressing her face into his shoulder. "I'm ready to fly." "Mrs. Dawson said Captain can have his own seat. Is that true?" Marcus held her tight, one hand on the back of her head, and for a moment the noise of the airport, the announcements, the rolling suitcases, the frustrated travelers disappeared entirely. There was only Sophie. There was only this. "Captain absolutely gets his own seat," Marcus said, pulling back to look at her. "He's a very important passenger." Sophie beamed. Marcus thanked Mrs. Dawson, who squeezed his hand and whispered, "Bring her back safe, and you be safe too." Then the old Buick pulled away, and it was just the two of them, a single father and his daughter, standing in the middle of a crowded airport with nowhere comfortable to go. Marcus led Sophie to the quietest corner he could find, a stretch of seats near the tall windows that looked out over the runways. Most of the seats were taken, but he found two together near the end of a row. He draped his jacket over one for Sophie, pulled a water bottle and a bag of animal crackers from his backpack, and settled in. Sophie pressed her nose against the cold glass. "Where's our plane, Daddy?" Marcus checked his phone. Tyler had texted, "On schedule, 1 hour out." "It's coming, sweetheart. A special one, just for us." Sophie's eyes went wide. "Like a movie plane?" Marcus laughed quietly. "Something like that." They had been sitting there for less than 20 minutes when Elena appeared. She was making her rounds through the terminal, not because it was her job to patrol the public areas, but because the VIP lounge's glass walls offered a clear view of the hallway, and she had noticed Marcus and Sophie sitting in the row of seats closest to the lounge entrance. They weren't in the lounge. They weren't blocking anything. They were simply visible. And to Elena, visibility was a form of contamination. She spoke quietly to a security guard stationed near the lounge, a young man with a buzz cut and an oversized uniform who looked like he had graduated from training approximately 3 weeks ago. He walked over to Marcus. "Sir, I'm going to need you to relocate to a different area. This section is reserved for guests transitioning to the premium lounge." Marcus looked up. "This is a public seating area. It's clearly marked." The guard shifted his weight. "I understand, sir, but we've had some concerns from." He didn't finish. Elena was already walking toward them, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. "Sir, I've already told you once," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes not from being right, but from being in charge. "You're making our premium guests uncomfortable. Please move, now." Sophie looked up from her animal crackers. She studied Elena with the unfiltered directness of a child who hadn't yet learned that some adults expected to be feared. "Are you the boss of the airport?" Sophie asked, her voice clear and curious. Elena blinked. "My daddy says bosses should be the kindest people," Sophie continued, "'cause everyone is watching them." The words hung in the air like a bell that had been struck. Elena opened her mouth, closed it, and looked away. Marcus placed his hand gently on Sophie's shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's find another spot." Marcus carried Sophie further down the terminal, past the crowded gates, past the overflowing food court, looking for anywhere they could sit without being treated like trespassers in a building that was supposed to be open to everyone. The airport was a mess. Every canceled flight had dumped its passengers into the same limited space, and the result was a kind of civilized chaos. People sitting on floors, leaning against walls, sprawled across their luggage like survivors of some comfortable catastrophe. A woman was arguing with a gate agent about a connection she was going to miss. A businessman was pacing in circles, shouting into his phone about a meeting in Chicago. Two teenagers were asleep on top of each other, using a suitcase as a pillow. Marcus finally found an empty stretch of floor near a window overlooking runway 2-7. He sat down with his back against the wall, and Sophie settled beside him, captain in her lap. "Daddy, why do people keep looking at us like that?" Sophie asked. She wasn't upset. She was genuinely puzzled, the way children are when the world does something that doesn't match the rules they've been taught. Marcus pulled her close. "We didn't do anything wrong, baby. Some people just look at the outside because they haven't learned how to see what's on the inside yet." Sophie thought about that for a moment, her small forehead creasing. "Mommy would have told them to be nicer," she said quietly. Marcus felt the air leave his chest. He swallowed hard and kissed the top of her head. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Yeah, she would have." The man from the VIP lounge, the one with the Financial Times, had stepped out to take a phone call. He stood near the windows, speaking in the clipped, confident tones of someone accustomed to moving money and people with equal indifference. He noticed Marcus and Sophie on the floor and wrinkled his nose. "They really should keep this terminal cleaner," he said, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "People just camp out anywhere these days." Marcus heard every word. His jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists against his knees, but Sophie was watching him with those gray-green eyes, and he knew that whatever he did next, she would remember it. So he did nothing. He just held her closer. His phone rang. Tyler's voice came through sharp and clear. "Boss, I'm on final approach. 15 minutes. The Gulfstream is coming in on runway 2-7. I've radioed the private terminal they're expecting you." Marcus stood and lifted Sophie onto his hip. "Time to go, sweetheart. Our ride is almost here." Sophie perked up. "The movie plane?" Marcus smiled. The movie plane. What neither Marcus nor Sophie knew was that a young mother sitting 3 rows away had been recording on her phone for the past 30 minutes. She had captured everything: Elena's dismissal at the lounge, the security guard's awkward intervention, Sophie's question about bosses, the man with the newspaper and his muttered insult, and Marcus sitting on the floor with his daughter, holding her with the kind of quiet dignity that no amount of money could manufacture. The video was already 47 minutes long, and she had no intention of stopping. Marcus walked toward the private terminal wing with Sophie on his hip and his backpack over one shoulder. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, they could see the runway stretching out into the gray winter morning, the tarmac dark and wet from the morning's frost, and then they heard it, the high, clean whine of jet engines descending through the cloud cover. a sound that started as a whisper and built into something unmistakable. A Gulfstream G700 appeared out of the overcast sky like a blade cutting through silk. It was white, immaculate, with a small logo on the tail, a stylized falcon in flight, the emblem of Caldwell Dynamics. The jet touched down with barely a sound, its wheels kissing the tarmac with the precision of a machine built by people who understood that elegance was not decoration, but engineering. It taxied smoothly toward the private terminal and stopped directly in front of the lounge windows, as if the universe had a sense of theater. Sophie pointed at the window. "Daddy, is that our special plane?" Her voice was loud enough to turn heads. Marcus nodded. "That's ours, baby." Tyler Marsh stepped out of the cockpit door before the stairs had fully extended. He was 29, lean, with the kind of posture that never fully leaves a man who spent 4 years in military aviation. He wore a pressed flight suit with the Caldwell Dynamics patch on his shoulder, and he walked into the terminal with the focused energy of someone who had a schedule to keep and zero patience for obstacles. He went straight to the VIP lounge counter, where Elena Navarro was reviewing her guest manifest. "I'm here for Mr. Caldwell and his daughter," Tyler said. "Could you direct me?" Elena glanced up. The name didn't register. "Caldwell? We don't have anyone by that." Tyler cut her off. His voice wasn't rude. It was military clean, direct, and entirely unconcerned with social niceties. "He doesn't fly commercial today. That Gulfstream on the tarmac? That's his. He owns the company that built it." The sentence landed in the lounge like a stone dropped into still water. Elena's smile collapsed. Her hands went flat against the counter. She turned slowly toward the window, and there it was, the jet, white and gleaming, parked directly in front of the lounge, as if it had been placed there by a set designer making a point about irony. The man with the Financial Times lowered his newspaper. His mouth opened slightly. He stared at the jet, then at the terminal door where Marcus was walking in with Sophie on his hip, and something in his expression shifted from smugness to the particular discomfort of a man realizing he has been profoundly, publicly wrong. Marcus entered the private terminal area. Tyler met him with a crisp nod. "Ready when you are, sir. Weather window is tight. We need to be wheels up in 20. Marcus adjusted Sophie on his hip. "Let's go." He started toward the tarmac doors, and then he heard Elena's voice behind him. "Mr. Caldwell." She was standing at the edge of the counter, her hands clasped in front of her, her face drained of color. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." Marcus stopped. He didn't turn fully. He just angled his head slightly, enough for his voice to carry. "You didn't need to realize anything, ma'am. You just needed to be decent." The words were quiet, unhurried, and absolutely devastating. He walked toward the tarmac door. Sophie, still on Marcus's hip, turned back and waved at Elena with the hand not holding captain. "Bye-bye, airport lady," she called out, her voice bright and guileless. It was the most innocent sentence anyone in that lounge had heard all morning, and it cut deeper than any accusation could have. Elena stood motionless behind the counter, watching the glass doors close behind them, and for the first time in 3 years of managing the expectations of the wealthy, she had no idea what to say. The video hit the internet within 2 hours. The young mother, a freelance photographer named Jenna Walsh, who had been stranded by the same canceled flight, uploaded the full recording to her social media account with a simple caption, "This man and his little girl were humiliated at Denver airport today." Then his private jet landed. The clip was edited down to 9 minutes, but the key moments were all there. Elena's dismissal, the security confrontation, Sophie's question about bosses and kindness, the newspaperman's sneer, and the reveal of the Gulfstream landing on the tarmac. Within 6 hours it had 4 million views. Within 12 hours it was on every major news aggregator in the country. The hashtag #BeDecent was trending nationally by nightfall. Derek Vaughn saw the video at 3:17 in the afternoon. He was sitting in his corner office on the administrative level of the airport, reviewing quarterly performance reports, when his assistant walked in without knocking, something she had never done before. "You need to see this," she said, and placed her phone on his desk. Derek watched the full 9 minutes without moving. He was 45 years old, a 20-year veteran of the airline industry, and he had spent the last decade managing the Denver hub's premium services division. He knew Elena Navarro. He had approved her promotion, and he knew Marcus Caldwell not personally, but professionally. Caldwell Dynamics held a $140 million logistics integration contract with the airline's cargo division. Marcus Caldwell wasn't just a passenger. He was one of the most valuable business partners the airline had. Derek called Elena into his office. She walked in with her chin up, still clinging to the posture of authority that had defined her career. But her eyes were different. Derek turned his monitor toward her and pressed play. Elena watched herself on screen, the dismissal, the condescension, the careful cruelty of her words, and with each passing second, something behind her eyes began to crack. He didn't look like a typical she started. Derek held up his hand. Didn't look like what, Elena? Like someone who deserves basic human respect? He told her she was suspended immediately, pending a full internal review. Elena walked out of Derek's office and stood alone in the corridor. Through the window, she could see the empty tarmac where the Gulfstream had been parked 2 hours earlier. It was gone now. The sky was flat and gray and offered nothing. For the first time that day, she wasn't thinking about her career or her reputation or the carefully constructed image she had spent years building. She was thinking about Sophie's face, those wide, curious eyes that hadn't been afraid, hadn't been angry, had simply looked at her and asked a question that no adult in that airport had thought to ask. "My daddy says bosses should be the kindest people." The sentence played on a loop in her head, and it hurt more than Derek's reprimand, more than the viral video, more than anything the internet could say about her. It hurt because it was true. The Gulfstream landed at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport just before 4 in the afternoon. Tyler brought the jet down smooth, cutting through the Potomac headwinds with the casual precision of a man who had once landed helicopters on moving ships. Marcus carried Sophie down the jet stairs and into a waiting car that took them to the Willard Hotel, 6 blocks from the White House. The room was elegant, but Marcus barely noticed. He was focused on Sophie, helping her change into the dress Mrs. Dawson had packed, brushing her hair and pulling it into a ponytail that took him 4 attempts, tying the small white bow that Rachel had bought 2 years ago and Sophie still insisted on wearing. Sophie stood on the bathroom counter and looked at herself in the mirror. "Do I look pretty, Daddy?" Marcus looked at her reflection, Rachel's eyes, Rachel's chin, that same stubborn tilt of the head, and his throat tightened. "You look like your mom," he said. "That's the prettiest thing I know." The ceremony was held in a ballroom at the National Defense University. The room was filled with generals, defense secretaries, aerospace executives, and policy advisors, the kind of people who understood that the wars of the future would be fought not with soldiers but with systems, and that the man standing backstage in a navy blue suit was one of the reasons America was winning that race. Marcus stood behind the curtain and adjusted his tie for the 3rd time. His hands, which could wire a drone guidance system in the dark, were trembling slightly. It wasn't the audience that made him nervous. It was the suit. The last time he had worn it, he had been standing in front of a casket. When Marcus walked to the podium, the applause was formal, respectful, the kind given to someone whose work spoke for itself. But Marcus didn't talk about drones. He didn't talk about guidance systems or government contracts or the future of autonomous warfare. He talked about Rachel. He told them about a woman who had spent 9 months dying and never once complained. He told them that in her last weeks, when she could barely lift her hand, she had written letters to Sophie, 1 for every birthday, until she turned 18. He told them that Rachel had believed, with a conviction that bordered on stubbornness, that a person's value had nothing to do with what they owned, or what they wore, or what kind of seat they sat in on an airplane. And then he told them about that morning. He didn't name the airport. He didn't name Elena. He simply said that his daughter had asked a woman a question. "My daddy says bosses should be the kindest people." He paused and looked at the room full of the most powerful people in American defense. "My daughter still believes that," he said. "I want to keep building a world where she's right." The room was silent for 3 full seconds before the applause began. Sophie sat in the front row next to Tyler, Captain on her lap, clapping with both hands. When Marcus stepped off the stage, she ran to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. He knelt down and held her. "This one's for Mommy," he whispered. Sophie nodded against his shoulder. "Mommy already knows, Daddy." 3 days after the airport incident, Elena Navarro sat on the floor of her studio apartment in Aurora, Colorado, with her laptop open and a cup of cold coffee beside her. The apartment was small, a single room with a kitchenette, a fold-out bed, and a wall that held 2 things, a framed photo of her mother and a plaque that read, "Employee of the Month November." She had earned that plaque 2 months ago. It felt like it belonged to someone else now. She watched the video again. She had watched it perhaps 30 times by now, but each time she found herself looking at something different. This time, she watched Sophie the way the little girl had looked up at her without any fear, without any anger, with nothing but honest curiosity. And she watched herself, the tilt of her chin, the dismissive sweep of her eyes, the way she had spoken to Marcus as though he were an inconvenience rather than a human being. She recognized the performance. She had perfected it. And she hated it. The memory came without warning, the way the worst memories always do. She was 12 years old. Her mother, Rosa Navarro, worked as a housekeeper at the Grand Cascade Hotel in downtown Denver, a 5-star property where the lobby smelled like orchids and the guests wore watches that cost more than Rosa earned in a year. Elena had come to pick up her mother after a late shift. She was standing in the service corridor, wearing a second-hand jacket and sneakers with a hole in the left toe, when the hotel manager, a man in a gray suit with a voice like polished marble, walked past and stopped. He looked at Elena, then at Rosa, and said, without cruelty but with absolute certainty, "Use the back entrance." Guests don't need to see this. The word "this" had covered everything. Their clothes, their skin, their existence. Elena had never forgotten the way that word felt. It was the feeling of being erased while you were still standing in the room. She had spent the next 20 years making sure no one would ever look at her like that again. She had straightened her hair, sharpened her accent, learned which brands mattered and which ones didn't, and climbed her way into a position where she was the one who decided who belonged and who didn't. And in doing so, she had become the man in the gray suit. She had become the door that closes. Elena called her mother. Rosa picked up on the first ring, the way she always did, as though she had been waiting by the phone her entire life for the moment one of her children would need her. Elena couldn't speak at first. She just cried the ugly, shaking kind of crying that strips away every defense, every mask, every carefully constructed version of yourself, until there is nothing left but the raw truth of who you are. When she finally told her mother what had happened, all of it, the lounge, the little girl, the jet, the video, Rosa was quiet for a long time. Then she said, in the steady voice of a woman who had spent her life being underestimated and had never once let it make her unkind, "Mija, I cleaned their floors so you could walk through their front doors, but I never taught you to close those doors on someone else." That night, Elena sat at her small kitchen table and wrote a letter by hand. She addressed it to Marcus Caldwell, Ridgeline, Colorado, the return address she had found through the airline's records. She didn't ask for her job back. She didn't explain or justify. She wrote, "Your daughter asked me if I was the boss of the airport, and she said bosses should be the kindest people. I was the boss, and I was not kind. That is something I will carry for the rest of my life." The letter arrived at Marcus's house on a Thursday afternoon, tucked between an electric bill and a catalog for farm equipment. Sophie was in the backyard, throwing a tennis ball for Biscuit, the golden retriever who had appeared on their porch 2 years ago and never left. Marcus stood in the kitchen and read the letter slowly, leaning against the counter next to the shelf where Rachel's photograph sat in a simple wooden frame. The late afternoon sun came through the window and fell across the photograph, catching the curve of Rachel's smile, and for a moment Marcus felt the particular ache that never fully went away, not the sharp grief of the early days, but the deep, quiet kind that lived in the spaces between ordinary moments. He read Elena's letter twice. He wasn't angry. He hadn't been angry at the airport, and he wasn't angry now. What he felt was something harder to name, a recognition, maybe, that people were complicated. That cruelty often came from wounds that had never properly healed, and that the woman who had told him to get out was not the same woman who had written these words on this page. He set the letter down next to Rachel's photograph and looked at her face, the smile that always seemed to know something he didn't, the eyes that saw through every defense he ever tried to build. He could almost hear her voice, the voice that had guided him through the worst years of his life and continued to guide him now, 3 years after it had fallen silent. "People aren't their worst moments, Marcus," she would have said. "They're what they do after." He stood there for a long time, the late light shifting across the kitchen floor, the sound of Sophie's laughter drifting in from the backyard, and he made a decision. Marcus picked up his phone and called Derek Vaughn. He didn't call to advocate for Elena. He didn't call to interfere with the airline's internal process. He simply asked what was happening. Derek told him that Elena's termination would be finalized by the end of the week. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's your call, Derek. But the woman who wrote this letter isn't the same woman who told me to get out. If she were, she wouldn't have written it." Derek paused. He hadn't expected that. He said he would take it under consideration. Marcus sat at the kitchen table and wrote a reply on a sheet of notebook paper, the same kind Sophie used for her schoolwork. He kept it short. "Miss Navarro, Sophie is fine. She still believes that bosses should be the kindest people. I hope the next time you meet someone who doesn't look like they belong, you remember that you were that person once. Don't apologize to me. Live differently." That's enough. 6 months later, on a bright September morning, Elena Navarro stood behind a check-in counter at Denver International Airport, not the VIP lounge counter, not the premium services desk, the regular check-in counter in Terminal 2, where the economy passengers lined up with their oversized bags and their crumpled boarding passes and their crying toddlers. Derek Vaughn had given her one final chance. On one condition, she would start over, from the bottom, with no title, no authority, and no glass doors to stand behind. A young father approached the counter. He had 2 small children clinging to his legs, a duffel bag held together with duct tape, and 3 economy tickets to Minneapolis. He looked exhausted. He looked overwhelmed. He looked, Elena realized with a clarity that stung, exactly the way Marcus Caldwell had looked 6 months ago. She checked him in quickly, found 3 seats together near the window, printed his boarding passes, and handed them over with a smile that had nothing performative in it. "Have a safe flight, sir," she said. The man blinked, surprised. "Thank you," he said. That's really nice of you." At the next counter, Grace Pemberton glanced over and gave a small, quiet nod. It was near the end of Elena's shift when she heard it, a voice she recognized instantly, high and bright and utterly without pretense. "Hi, airport lady." Elena looked up. Sophie Caldwell was standing at the counter, captain dangling from one hand, grinning with the radiant confidence of a child who had never once doubted that the world was fundamentally good. Behind her, Marcus Caldwell walked up, flannel shirt, muddy boots, battered backpack. He looked exactly the same. He looked at Elena, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Welcome back, Mr. Caldwell," Elena said. Her voice was steady, warm, and entirely without pretense. "Let me take care of you and Sophie." She checked them in with the same efficiency and warmth she had given the young father 10 minutes earlier. No special treatment, no apology tour. Just the simple, professional kindness of a person doing her job the way it was supposed to be done. Sophie placed Captain on the counter. "This is Captain. He's my bodyguard." Elena leaned down so she was eye level with the little girl. "He looks very brave." Sophie studied Elena for a moment with those gray-green eyes that missed nothing. "Are you still the boss?" Elena shook her head slowly. "No," she said, "but I'm trying to be the kindest person." Sophie considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old philosopher. Then she nodded. "That's even better." Marcus picked up his boarding passes. He looked at Elena one last time and gave a small nod, not a gesture of forgiveness exactly, but something close to it. An acknowledgement, a recognition that people could change, and that sometimes the proof wasn't in grand declarations, but in the quiet way someone handed a boarding pass to a tired father with duct tape on his bag. Then he turned and took Sophie's hand, and they walked toward the gate. Grace Pemberton watched them go from behind her counter. Her eyes were wet. She whispered, so softly that only she could hear it. Rachel would be proud. Sophie walked beside her father, captain swinging from her free hand, her pink backpack bouncing with each step. Elena watched them until they disappeared around the corner, the flannel shirt, the muddy boots, the battered backpack. They looked exactly the same as the first time she had seen them. Exactly the same. But this time, she saw something different. She saw enough